Hello everyone! Today I'm making a Joker dress tutorial based on an old school Joker, and I'm using the McCall's 7853. This was actually a well anticipated pattern that I've been wanting to make since I hauled it in one of my last haul videos, and I was a little let down of the simplicity of the pattern because the picture shows something a little more fuller. But in the end, once I dressed it up with the hair and the makeup and everything, it really came together, and I think it actually worked out really well. I did wear this to a Halloween party and it was actually pretty comfortable. I'll be making mine in a size 16. And I will be doing view A and then the Dickey for view B. So for this project, I made everything with a cotton fabric. Make sure you pre-wash to accommodate for shrinking. And other than that, you'll just need a few things like the zipper and hook and loop, and of course your buttons. And then there's quite a few pattern pieces to cut out in quite a few different fabrics. So that'll take a little bit of time to do. So go ahead and cut everything out and we can start putting this all together. And make sure to mark all of your dots and notches on all of your pattern pieces. So going to our bodice front pieces, we're gonna start with the dart. So start by taking a sewing pin and we're gonna go through those bottom two dots first, connecting them to each other. Then we're gonna grab the top inner dot and we're gonna make this sort of pleat, and then you're just going to pin this pleat in place. Make sure we're doing this on the wrong side of the fabric. Then we're going to do the same thing to the darts on the bodice back pieces. So all four of these darts. So going to my machine, I'm going to start at that top inner dot and I'm going to angle toward those bottom dots. And I'm just going to try and sew in a straight line all the way to the bottom. Take your scissors and we're going to cut off that dart, leaving about a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Iron these seam allowances toward the center of the front bodice. And on the back pieces, iron them toward the center back. We're going to align the front and back bodice pieces right sides together. Match up the sides and the shoulders. Sew these together at a 5/8 inch seam allowance. Going to the center front of the front bodice pieces, pin them together with right sides together, and then sew this with the 5/8 inch seam allowance, making sure to start and stop between the first and last dot. Iron open all of the seams. Going to our collar pieces, we're going to add interfacing to the wrong side of two pieces and iron these on. Turn these over and with right sides together, lay the second collar piece on top of each one. Pin up the sides. And we're going to sew the short side and the long curved side at a 5/8 inch seam allowance. When we get to that little triangle, you're going to stop at the dot, go to the inner dot, and then back down to that outer dot And at the corner, we're gonna stop at that outer dot there. So what I'm gonna do for this triangle is I'm gonna make it to that first dot, lift my presser foot, pivot to the new direction, sew all the way to that inner dot, do the same thing, pivoting to the next dot. I'm gonna sew straight up to that last one, and then I can change the direction back to the one I was sewing before, all the way to that last dot at the end. Cut off half of this seam allowance, and then I'm going to cut as close as I can to that inner corner of that triangle. Make sure you don't cut past any thread. And I'm just going to take out a little more fabric to get rid of some of the bulk. And I will also cut off a little bit on that sharp corner. Turn your collar piece right side out. You can use a pencil or chopstick to poke out those corners. Make sure the edges lay out nicely, and we're going to press this all in place. Pin up that open edge, and we're going to do a base stitch of a 5/8 inch seam allowance. Going to the front of the bodice neckline, we're going to take one collar piece and line up the raw edge with the neckline edge, lining up the notches, and we're going to pin these down. You really want to focus on making the points of the collar line up with the center V of the neckline. So even just pinning it, you can kind of fold it back and make sure it's as close as it can be and adjust from there. Grab your lining pieces, and we're going to sew these together the same way. On your lining piece, fold up the bottom edge 5/8 inches toward the wrong side. Cut off half of this seam allowance. Take your lining and lay it right sides together with your bodice piece, making sure to line up the corners, the seams, and the notches, and then pin this all together. Sew these at a 5/8 inch seam allowance. Cut off half of this seam allowance. Open up your lining and bodice, making sure the collar leans toward the bodice, and you want the seam to lean toward the lining. We're going to top stitch the seam allowance to the lining at a 1/8 inch. Fold the lining into the bodice. And then we're going to iron that edge with the collar to press it all in place. Pin the armholes together, matching the seams and the notches. Sew these at a 5/8 inch seam allowance. Going to the sleeves, we're going to do a gathering base stitch across the 3 dots. Start with a tail of 3 to 4 inches of thread, and we're going to do a 1/8 inch seam allowance base stitch from one outside dot to the other. Then leave a tail of thread at the end as well. Do the same thing at a 3/8 inch seam allowance. Fold your sleeves right sides together, matching that long edge. Sew these at a 5/8 inch seam allowance. Iron open your seams. Going to the bottom of the sleeve, we're going to hem up the bottom. So we're going to fold it over 3/8 inches and iron it down all the way around. And then we're going to fold it over another 3/8 inches, ironing it down. Sew these at a 3/8 inch seam allowance or just before the edge. Turn your sleeves right side out. Taking your bodice with your bodice inside out, we're going to match the notches on the sleeves to the matches of the armhole. Once you find a matching pair, put your sleeve inside your armhole, match up the bottom seam, the top middle dot with the shoulder seam, line up the bottom straight edges and notches, and then when you get to the gathering section, you're going to grab your top 2 threads, pulling gently but firmly to gather them up to match with the armhole. Move around your gathers to distribute them evenly, and then you can pin this in place. Sew these on at a 5/8 inch seam allowance. Going to our sleeve head, we're going to fold these in half lengthwise and pin up the top edge. We're going to do another gathering base stitch just like we did with our sleeves. Start gathering up your sleeve head, and we want the dots on the sleeve head to match up with the dots that are on the sleeve. Once you have it gathered to the length that you need, pin it in place and then move around your gathers to distribute them evenly. Sew this on at a 5/8 inch seam allowance. Then go ahead and finish off these edges with either a serge or a zigzag stitch. So we can put aside our bodice for now. And moving on to the peplum front and the peplum back pieces, we're going to line up that short edge, laying them right sides together. Go ahead and do the same thing to your lining pieces. Sew up these sides at a 5/8 inch seam allowance. Iron open these seams. Take your peplum piece and lay it right sides together with your lining peplum piece. Mine just happened to be the same fabric. Go ahead and pin up the straight edge and the long bottom curve. Sew these edges at a 5/8 inch seam allowance. Then go ahead and do the same thing to the other 2 pieces. Cut off half of the seam allowance. Open it up, and once again we're going to lay the seam allowance toward the lining, and we're going to top stitch it down at a 1/8 inch seam allowance, and you're going to go as far as you can into the corner. Turn this right side out, and then folding out the edges nicely, we're going to press it in place. Pin up the top open edge. And we're going to base stitch these closed at a 5/8 inch seam allowance. take your bodice and open up your bodice pieces, having the front piece face up. Lay your peplum with right sides together, matching the center fronts, and pin those raw edges together. Sew this on at a 5/8 inch seam allowance. Going to our skirt front and our skirt back pieces, we're going to lay them right sides together, pinning up the outer edges. And then that last open edge, we're going to pin it up, but only up to that dot that we've made from our pattern piece. Sew these at a 5/8 inch seam allowance. Iron open the seams. Do a gathering base stitch across that top edge. Taking your bodice piece, we're going to fold it with right sides face out. Your peplum is still folded over. And that open two edges, we're going to match it with the open edges on the top of the skirt. Line up the corners first. And then you can go through matching the center front and the side seams. We're going to start pulling up the gathers on the skirt, making sure to match the size of each section. Once you have the size that you need, you're going to just move around your gathers to distribute them evenly and pin it all in place. Sew this on at a 5/8 inch seam allowance. Iron the seam allowance up toward the bodice. Going to the back open edge, we're going to line up the linings together. And pin this up. We're going to do a base stitch at a 5/8 inch seam allowance. Take your zipper and opening it up with right sides together so that your teeth line up with the base stitch seam, and you want the metal piece to match up to the neckline seam allowance. Pin this down to only the seam allowance. Sew this on at a base stitch down the center of the zipper, just as far down as you can go. Zip your zipper back up, and then we're going to base stitch this down through all layers. Make sure to pin this first because I struggled getting it straight when I didn't do it. But you're just going to go down one side with your zipper foot, going over that middle stitch. When you get to the bottom, you're going to pivot your fabric again, going across the bottom right under the notch, and then pivot again to go up the other side. Once you finish this stitch, go ahead and use a seam ripper to open up that base stitch seam we originally sewed right over the zipper teeth. Then we're going to sew over all of this again, making sure to start and stop right there where the bodice meets the skirt, which worked out for me since I'm using two different colors anyways. Take your lining and starting at the edge of the zipper, tuck that extra tag underneath and fold over the edge 5/8 inches to line up just before those zipper teeth. Pin this all the way down. At the bottom edge of the lining, you're going to match up the center fronts first, and you're going to pin the seams together. Then go to the other side of the zipper and pin the lining down there as well. Go ahead and slip stitch all these edges down. Going to the bottom edge of our skirt, we're going to hem it up by folding it over 3/8 inches and ironing it down all the way across. Then fold it up another 3/8 inches and iron this down all the way across. Sew this at a 3/8 inch seam allowance or just before the edge. And then we can place our buttons and sew each of these on. The black necktie is very simple. You're just going to cut out a strip that is 1.5 inches wide and 42 inches long. Fold this in half right sides together. Sew up one short end and down the long edge at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Turn it right side out, press it in place, fold in that open edge and slip stitch it closed. And there you have a simple necktie to go perfectly with this costume. Going to our Dickey collar, we're going to add the inner facing to the wrong side. Then we're going to take our Dickey front and lay our Dickey back pieces right sides together, matching the shoulders. Do this to the lining pieces as well. Sew these at a 5/8 inch seam allowance. Iron open the seams. Lay your Dickey and your lining piece together, right sides together. Pin the straight edge and the outside edge all the way around. Sew these at a 5/8 inch seam allowance. Cut off half of the seam allowance. Just like before, we're going to open this up, leaving the seam allowance toward the lining, and we're going to top stitch this down at a 1/8 inch seam allowance. Remember, getting as close to the corners as you can. Doesn't have to be perfect. Fold it right sides out, lining out the edges nicely, ironing them in place. Fold over one edge of the collar 5/8 inches and iron it down. Do a base stitch straight down the middle. Open up the Dickey neckline as straight as you can get it, and we're going to lay the collar piece right sides together, matching up the raw edges at those notches. This will be kind of awkward and funky, so you just have to kind of stretch it out a little bit to make sure everything lines up and pin it in place. So when you do sew it, you just kind of hold it firmly so that everything lays flat as it goes through the machine. Cut off half of the seam allowance. Iron the seam allowance toward the collar. Fold your collar right sides together, matching the folded edge to the seam, and pin up the sides. We're going to sew the sides at a 5/8 inch seam allowance, making sure to get it straight right before the edge of the Dickey. Cut off half of the seam allowance. Fold your collar right side out. Then fold the collar in half, making sure the folded edge matches up with the seam allowance, and pin it down. Slip stitch this edge closed. Grabbing our hook and loop, I'm just going to start just below the collar edge and stop just above the bottom edge of the Dickey. I'm going to cut off this piece. Make sure you cut the front and the back of this. On the left side, I'm going to go to the inside of my Dickey. I'm going to pin on the rough side. Then on the outside of the right side, you're going to use the soft side and pin this down, just right up against the edges. Sew these on around all 4 edges on each piece. And there you have it. It's simple, but once you put all the pieces together, it's very effective. When I had it on the mannequin, I was a little afraid that it wasn't what I wanted, but like I said, once I put it on with all of the details of the makeup and the hair, everything just came together so perfectly. Really fit my figure nicely, and like I said, it was super comfortable to wear, especially to a Halloween party. It was a little warm, but it was really nice. And I love how the sleeves, even though it had that extra puff factor, they weren't too puffy for me. I did finally give in and bought a wig, so hopefully we'll see more wigs in the future. But it was definitely a nod toward the old school Joker that I've grown up with. So I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. Please subscribe if you have not already, and I hope to see you all in the next one. Thanks for watching. Bye!